Too often we hear other people's stories and they leave out all the really challenging parts, and you wonder how they got from the beginning to the end without all the difficulties that you seem to be facing. This always made me wonder, what was wrong with me? Why did other people seem to have it so much easier? Why did they seem to struggle less than I did? But the more I talked to them, the more I realized they were struggling just as much as I was. They just weren't sharing those difficult parts, usually because it's too hard to talk about. And when you go through something difficult, when you finally get to the other side of it, the last thing you want to do is talk about it. You want to leave it in the past. But that doesn't help anyone else who is walking a similar path. So that's what I want to do here. I want to talk about some of the challenges that Lance and I faced throughout our life. We lived in the unknown all the years that Lance was sick. He was well enough to work during the earlier days, but that was about it. We didn't do much else during the week because he didn't have the energy. Those days were the hardest days for me because he didn't look sick. And so people rarely believed me that he didn't feel up to participating in activities. And I got blamed a lot for the fact that we did not spend as much time with people as they thought we should. Those were the invisible illness years.
I think one of the most valuable parts of this conversation is just the honesty of what a challenging life looks like, and that it's not always the same for everyone. What is challenging for me might not be challenging for you, and opening that up so that people feel comfortable sharing what's challenging to them, and that their friends and loved ones can respond in a way that's kind, empathetic, understanding, or just be a listening ear when someone is trying to share their struggles. The hardest years, these years that we're talking about, was social media a thing then? Was because I know that my most challenging times thus far, social media has been an ever-present part of life, and something that made those challenges even harder because there's so much comparison that occurs in a space that's not real.
In the beginning, social media was not a part of that because he was first diagnosed in the mid-90s. So we didn't really deal with social media until after he retired from work. And by then, it was more obvious that there were things wrong with him because he couldn't work anymore, but he still didn't look as sick. One of the really hard parts for me during that time was Lance was vulnerable, and I always did my best to protect him. So I would give people just enough information to know what was going on. And I didn't dig any deeper. I didn't give them a lot of details because I didn't want to embarrass Lance. I didn't want Lance to feel bad. I didn't want Lance to feel guilty. And I didn't want people getting upset with him. So I always felt like it was enough to just say, Lance isn't feeling up to it. But there were people who did not accept that. And then when social media came about, I think that in the beginning with social media, it was not a good thing for me. I didn't really use social media until the last several years of his life. And I used it more as a way to let people know what was going on because we were so isolated. And that was the easiest way for me to keep everyone informed.
As you guys were walking through those years of what you termed invisible illness, where he didn't look sick, but you saw how exhausted he would become, how hard it was for him to do anything outside of just going to work or doing simple things around the house. Do you feel like, in hindsight, more honesty on your part about your real day-to-day struggles would have created more solidarity among friends and loved ones, do you think that would have impacted how they perceived you in hindsight?
I, in our situation, I don't know that that would have been helpful. I gave enough information that people should have realized. I mean, when you're going through chemotherapy, that alone should tell you this is a challenging situation. I shouldn't have to say, we're not really up for a trip at Christmas time because Lance is on chemo, something like that. So I don't think that I didn't share enough, but I did always share that we were going through something, and I shared enough about it. And I figured when people asked how things were going, if they didn't want to know, then they shouldn't ask. Because I did get a lot of people telling me that I shared too much information too. So it felt like the pressure was always on me to figure out how much to tell people and what people I should tell things to, because, these people who are close to us want to know everything, and these people who are close to us don't want to know anything. And we were left with the responsibility of trying to figure out what was best for everyone else, instead of, in our situation, we were struggling so much, and there were very few people at that time who really considered what it was that we needed.
So essentially, the burden was placed on you to determine who could tolerate what amount of information and still be okay, which I've watched other people with that same situation. And I think it's an unfortunate reality just among humans that, when push comes to shove, those relationships can be tested perhaps best by how much truth and reality you can tolerate in someone else's life.
I always felt like I was in a game of dodgeball, just waiting for the next thing to hit. And that included the hits that we got from people, because I was the one who took the brunt of all of that because I was protecting Lance. So that was really hard. But besides that, we were also trying to live as normal a life as possible. In the beginning, we were both working. He was working full time. I worked part time, sometimes not at all, so that I could take care of the house and the cars, or to be available for him, whatever was needed at the time. He was declining very slowly, and we didn't know what the future had in store for us. We continued to plan for our future, but by our mid 30s, we were already looking at accessibility options for housing, thinking he's going to need to retire when he's in his 50s. And he ended up having to retire at the age of 37. And a year and a half later, I quit my job to stay at home as his full-time caregiver. I was also 37. I never wanted to be a caregiver, and especially not to my husband, and not at such a young age. It was not my dream. And for many years, it felt like my nightmare.
I think a part of your story that is so compelling is the fact that you guys were so young living this life. And when I share your guys' story briefly with friends of mine or acquaintances, they nod their heads and follow along right up until the time that I mention your ages. And that suddenly jolts them, and their response is so different because you hear this story or see this scenario in people that are much older than what you guys were. So I think the obvious assumption when I share your story is that you were an elderly couple, maybe in your 60s or 70s, going through this. And not that that's any less heartbreaking, not that it would be any less challenging, but it's more common. When I share how young you guys were when you were doing all this, that is what catches people's attention. And I think causes them to perhaps relate to your struggle, at least in the sense that they realize what they were doing at the same age and how their life would have been very different had they been dealing with what you guys were dealing with. So I think the fact that you guys were so young is such an important part of your story because that lends itself to the social element that you've been describing, that's a time when people are socializing extensively. Maybe it's through their work, maybe it's through their kids, maybe it's through their job. That's when people are developing a lot of relationships that have something a little more foundational than just that they went to the same school. They're learning who they are and developing relationships based on their similarities. You didn't have anyone your age that was going through what you were going through. So that puts you in a space where you couldn't relate to anyone and they couldn't relate to you. You being in the minority probably put you in a space where you carried the burden of explanation to the people around you. And that's unfortunate.
Yes. I spent my 30s and 40s relating to people in their 70s and 80s. Most of my friends were much older because I couldn't relate to the people who were younger because I wasn't living the life that they were living. I couldn't relate to them and they couldn't relate to me. So I lived the life of a much older person from the time I was actually in my 20s. We were becoming more isolated in our 20s, and we were unable to do the things that our friends and family were doing in their 20s. And that was when we started really spending more time, just the two of us. And then as we got into our 30s and we really wanted to spend more time with people, the people that we could relate to, who could do the things that we could do, were the people who were retired. And so the strangest thing that has come out of that is I lived the life of an old person for so long, and now I feel like I'm young. I finally feel like I'm young. I never felt like that before. I was tired all those years. I finally, 4 years after he passed away, I finally feel like I have some energy now. But I feel younger now than I did when I was in my 20s because he was diagnosed when I was 23. So, and now I do have some older friends still. I have some amazing friends that I have kept in touch with, and I'm so thankful for their friendships and all the years that they were there to support me and that they're still there now. But this is the first time in my life in the last few years that I have really close friendships, multiple friendships with women closer to my age. And I love it. I love it so much.
You and I have talked about those years and the challenges of navigating relationships and people being in a completely different place where they didn't understand what you were going through, maybe because they didn't want to understand, or very likely because they just couldn't. You can't relate to something you haven't been through, and doesn't make it wrong. It just means there's a gap there. And one of the things that I always wanted to know, how can I say what I'm feeling without being hurtful or offensive unintentionally? And I wonder if you are able to give guidance. So for people supporting a caregiver or loved one going through something hard, what's something that would have been perhaps universally encouraging to you during the hardest of times?
I actually learned this from the people who said the right things. And one of the things that really bothered me, I'm going to start off with that, was complete silence. When I would say something and I would be met with complete silence, and I'm wondering, did we get disconnected? Did you hear what I said? And the response was always, I don't know what to say. So I would say this is a good thing to learn, for me too, because I learned it from other people. Simply saying, I see that this is hard. We felt seen. Saying, I hate that you are going through this. made us feel loved and cared for, saying, I am here if you need to talk, or if you just need me to sit with you, made us feel supported.
I can see how any of those three things would have also been and were encouraging to me when I've gone through challenging points in my life. Just hearing someone say, that sounds really awful, or oh wow, that's sounds really challenging, or oh my gosh, I can't imagine going through that. Just that was it. That was a simple thing that I didn't feel like I had to defend myself against. And in fact, it was encouraging to me because it put me back in a space where I could say, yes, but I'm getting through it. And so I don't know if it did that for you as well, but when someone would just meet me where I was and say that's hard, it allowed me to respond.
Well, you feel that solidarity. You don't feel like suddenly these simple words make you feel like I'm not doing this alone. There is someone here supporting me in whatever way they're supporting me right now.
Yeah. And it made me feel as though I was stronger than I thought I was. So it sounds like having just some honesty and solidarity would have made those challenging times more tolerable. Do you think that's the case?
I do, 100%. There were a lot of people in our life who were in denial of the fact that Lance was sick. So, on top of us dealing with the dementia and the cancer, we had to deal with other people's denial of the situation. And that was not helpful for anyone. I mean, I can understand why people don't want to face the reality that someone that you love is sick. It's a really hard thing to acknowledge, but it is not helpful to the people who have to live it 24/7 when they've also got to live with your denial. And it was actually harmful to everyone because it created a barrier between us and them because they weren't willing to look at the situation and how serious it was.
It feels like there was a distinct difference between people in your life who were in denial of the fact that he was sick and just struggling to accept that reality versus people who were going about maybe a normal life trajectory, doing the things that people would normally be doing at that age, who were just struggling to relate to what you guys were going through. And it sounds like you were able to navigate that in a way that put up boundaries to protect yourself from people who would cause you more stress, more grief, more challenge, as well as identify the people who maybe wanted to be in your life, but just were struggling to relate and invite them to participate in your life in a way that was helpful to you and helped them to find a way that they could relate to you. So you were able to kind of weed out the things that were troubling and find connection with the people who were trying but maybe didn't understand how.
I became very intentional about the way that I set up our life. Eventually, it took me a while to get to this point, but I finally realized that we didn't need to accommodate everyone else and we couldn't accommodate everyone else. We needed to focus on ourselves and we needed to do what was right for us. And we were told a lot that we were being selfish. And I'm just going to say it. We were not being selfish. That was self preservation, that was survival for us. The selfish people were the ones who were well, who expected us to accommodate them.
You've mentioned that you found out later that there were people who were going through the same thing that you were, but just weren't sharing their struggles. And it's fascinating to me that the same thing was happening to other people that perhaps was happening to you as well. And maybe for the same reasons, because they were being shut down, or maybe just because it's hard to share challenging things and navigate those conversations in an honest way and share something a little bit deeper than we're hanging in there without coming away feeling so negative. Did you ever experience what I'm trying to describe? Does that make sense? Or did you ever walk through a period where you felt like you couldn't be honest and share? And did you ever find a way to share your struggles without feeling negative, but without just being dismissive of the question and saying something like, we're hanging in there?
Uh, that's not really my style to just say we're hanging in there. If somebody asks me a question, I figured that they shouldn't ask if they don't want to know the answer. I will tell people what I'm thinking, but I know what you're saying. I did get a lot of negative response to the things that I said because they didn't really want to hear. A lot of times people didn't want to hear. But as I moved through that time in my life, it weeded out the people who didn't really belong in our life. If they didn't want to know, then they shouldn't have asked. And my life was hard. It was incredibly hard. I prayed for my own death for many years because the burden that I carried was so heavy. I didn't know how I was going to make it through another day. I wasn't suicidal, but it was just that hard. So to stop and worry about what someone else is thinking about me expressing myself when they have asked me to, that's not my problem. And living my life that way weeded out a lot of people. And I'm not sorry for that. I don't feel like we should have to be dishonest or hide from the things that we are going through just because somebody else is uncomfortable with it. Get over it, get used to it. Life is hard. And at some point, you might be the person going through that very hard situation. And how would you feel if somebody treated you like that? It's not okay. So you can probably tell I didn't win a lot of friends with that attitude, but you know what? It protected me and it protected Lance, and that was my goal. My goal is not to go through life having as many friends as I can, because your true friends and your family too, those are the ones who will stick by you no matter what. And they want to know what's going on in your life because they want to know how they can support you.
I love that. I think maybe I got there. I think my personality tends to want to keep the peace and make everyone happy, and that did not lend itself well to to finding support when I was going through challenging things. When you mentioned that you found out later on that other people were going through struggles, um, do you think that they might have been more successful had they felt more comfortable sharing the challenging parts of their lives? Do you think that that might have helped them to get through those challenging times if they had felt more comfortable sharing and being honest? Or do you think it's just a defense mechanism that's part of living that life?
I think that a lot of that really depends on personality. I mean, what I just said, and you stated that you reacted differently because of your personality. You need to be comfortable in the things that you do. And if you're not comfortable sharing something, then it's not going to make you feel better. But I think it's important to get comfortable doing that because it is easier when you have someone to share the burden with you. That was the main reason that I had a counselor, because I knew that I had somebody outside of my everyday life that I could go in and I could talk to about everything. And I knew that I wasn't going to run into her in the grocery store or wherever I was, that I was seeing people that I know. And I didn't have to worry about her talking about me behind my back or, just sharing things that I didn't want to share with the whole world. So counseling was one of the most important things for me during that time. And if you don't have friends that you can confide in, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you should at least have a counselor. And if you can't see a counselor, try journaling because it's good to get those things out. I do think that in some of the instances that I'm thinking of, some of the friends that I had, that it may have been beneficial to them had they had some sort of outlet for getting it out. Not necessarily another person, but journaling, even exercising. That's another good way to, if you can't talk, if you can't communicate it, exercising is a good way to work through some of that frustration too.
I can see that. I tend to be a little bit more of an open book with my life. I don't really know what being private is like. So when I was going through challenging things, um, it made me painfully aware of the fact that many people are not interested in hearing about your challenges. They're only interested in hearing the good things. And so people that I believe to be friends or somebody in whom I could confide quickly revealed themselves as very disinterested in anything that was hard that I was sharing. They only wanted to hear the good things. They wanted to hear how things were improving. They wanted to hear how things were getting better. I can see how sharing those things could be beneficial to the people around me and create that sense of community and solidarity and let people know that they're not alone. But I can also see where maybe a counselor or journaling might be preferable because there are plenty of people that just aren't ready to hear that. They're just not ready for whatever reason. They can't or won't hear things that are hard to hear.
Right. And that was something that I dealt with a lot. And that was one of the things that made me feel more alone because I wasn't able to share with a lot of people. And then that went back to the kind of weeding out the people in my life and really made it clear the level of a relationship that I had with people. So the people who were willing to be there to really listen, to support me in whatever way they could, those are the people who have remained my close friends, and the people who were there to just, like you said, they want to hear the good things. They want to celebrate the good things with you. Those people play a smaller role in my life because it's important to have all kinds of people. You're not going to have all close friends. You're going to have acquaintances and varying types of relationships, but it does make it more clear the type of relationship you have with people when you go through something hard. I do want to go through and talk about some of the really challenging parts of that life because we've talked about how these things made me feel, but I want to really share some of the really hard parts that people really didn't talk about or people didn't want to hear. And I'm just sharing this in case there's somebody else out there that is feeling this that needs to hear it. It took a lot of hard work for me to get from the beginning to the end. It was 25 years of Lance being sick. So that was a lot of time to deal with all the things that we've already talked about. And there was a period of about 4 years in there where I felt like running away every single day. There were times that I got in my car and left with the intention of never returning. And I would grab my purse and I would get in the car and I would take off and think, I'm never going back. I could go drive to the mountains and hide somewhere and nobody will ever find me. I mean, it was that bad. It was so challenging. But in addition to that time, I lived in a fog for over a decade. I was sleep deprived. I was depressed, lack of self care, losing my identity. And everyone seemed to be focused on Lance and what he needed. Nobody was paying attention to what I needed. I felt insignificant. I felt like I did not matter. And I've already said it, but that was the time that I prayed for my death nearly every night because I just felt like I could not do this for one more day. And like I said, I wasn't suicidal, but it was so challenging. And then on top of it, everybody only wanted to hear the good things. Everybody only wanted to celebrate with us. So if I didn't have my counselor during that time, and if I didn't have my gym friends and the time that I spent at the gym, I don't know what would have happened. Because beyond that, I didn't have what felt like anything good. And all of those hard things that we were facing then, those were the things that made me become very intentional about the way that I set things up. And that's what I talked about earlier about setting things up so that it worked for us. If I hadn't done that too, then I really don't know that I would have made it all those years because it was so challenging. And I had to stop caring what other people thought because I was getting criticized a lot for the things that I did, but it was also people who were on the outside looking in, not offering any help, only offering opinions and criticisms. And that is not helpful. So when I shut out the toxic people and I focused on the positive, that changed our mindset too. And that helped a lot.
One of the things that I've learned most from you and your experience and the things that you've shared with me is just that intention. Really just being purposeful about what you're doing and why you're doing it, being honest with yourself and being honest with everyone else, and not allowing the discomfort of the people around you to dictate how you will proceed in life, but rather allowing the truth of your situation to guide your way forward. You've been an excellent example of that. And truly, when you tell me these stories, I don't know how you could have gotten through what you got through without making truth your beacon. I just can't see that you would have made it through as well as you guys did.
No, I don't think that we would have either. Well, I hope that having this discussion and sharing some of these things is helpful to people who are going through this and also to people who are supporting someone who is going through a challenging time because it can be really hard to open up and be vulnerable about some of the most challenging things that you face. And like I said, I hope that this is helpful. And thanks so much for joining me, Jenna, and having this tough conversation with me.
Thank you for having me. It was good to chat.
All right. I will see you next time.
Bye.